Imagine it is the hottest week of July, the kind of afternoon where the air feels heavy before you even step outside. The porch boards are warm enough that nobody wants to walk across them barefoot. The garden leaves are hanging low. The chickens have disappeared into the shade. Even the dog has given up and stretched himself under the wagon. You step out the back door expecting to see your father-in-law carrying a bucket toward the garden. The tomatoes need water. The beans need water. Everything in the garden looks thirsty. Instead, he walks right past every plant on the property, past the tomatoes, past the cucumbers, past the beans without slowing down. Then he stops at the porch, lifts the bucket, and pours every drop of water across the porch boards. Not the garden, the porch. The first time I saw him do that, I looked at the thirsty tomatoes, then at the bucket, then at the porch and thought, well, somebody is watering the wrong thing. I looked at my wife. She smiled. Then she said, give it 20 minutes. That was more than 30 years ago, and it was the beginning of a lesson I've never forgotten. 20 minutes later, the porch felt different, not cold, not air-conditioned, comfortable. The kind of comfortable where you stop thinking about the heat. And that's when I realized my father-in-law wasn't trying to cool the farm. He was trying to cool the people. Most people think summer comfort comes from cooling the air. My father-in-law thought about cooling the space around the person. That sounds like a small difference. It isn't. The average person looks at a 95-degree day and thinks, how do I cool the air? My father-in-law looked at the same day and asked, what's making this spot uncomfortable? One question leads to machines. The other leads to observation. And my father-in-law was one of the most observant people I have ever known. He noticed things most people walk past. The first thing he noticed was that the air wasn't always the real problem. The surfaces were. Think about a porch in July. The boards sit in direct sunlight for hours. The railings absorb heat. The steps absorb heat. The concrete underneath absorbs heat. Everything becomes a giant battery storing summer energy. Then, long after the sun begins to drop, all that stored heat starts moving back into the air around you. That's why some porches feel miserable even in the evening. The heat never really left. It simply changed where it was hiding. My father-in-law understood that before I ever did. At the time I thought that sounded strange. Now I think he was exactly right. I remember one particular July afternoon when I finally understood what he meant. The thermometer hanging in the shade read 94 degrees. A neighbor stopped by and stood talking with us for a while. My father-in-law smiled, but he didn't answer. After the neighbor left, I asked him why. He pointed at the porch boards. Then he pointed at the shade tree. Then he pointed at the gravel path leading toward the barn. Finally, he said, most folks notice temperature. That sentence stayed with me, because once you start looking for heat instead of temperature, you notice things differently. You notice the black driveway still hot after sunset. You notice a metal mailbox you can't touch in July. You notice the brick wall radiating warmth at 9 o'clock at night. The weather wasn't changing. The surfaces were. And my father-in-law understood that decades before I did. Now let's talk about the water, because the water is where most people get confused. The bucket wasn't cooling the porch, because water is magical. The bucket worked because of evaporation. When water evaporates, it takes heat with it. That's the entire secret. The same reason sweat cools your skin. The same reason a wet towel feels cooler. The same reason people hung damp sheets and open windows before air conditioning became common. Heat leaves with the water. My father-in-law didn't explain it with science. He explained it with results. The porch was hot. The porch became cooler. That was enough evidence for him. The older I get, the more I appreciate that. Not every useful lesson needs a textbook. Sometimes you just pay attention. And that's exactly what he did. The interesting thing is that once I noticed the porch trick, I started noticing other things. He wasn't doing one strange thing. He was following a pattern. For example, on especially hot days, he would lightly water the dirt path near the porch. Not enough to create mud, just enough to darken the soil. Later, that area felt cooler too, the same principle, evaporation. Sometimes he hung damp burlap near a sitting area. Again, the same principle. Sometimes he watered shaded ground before people gathered there. Same principle. Over and over I saw the same lesson. He wasn't trying to cool the entire property. He was cooling the places where people actually spent time. That sounds obvious now. But most people people don't think that way. Modern solutions often try to cool everything. My father-in-law focused on the important few feet around a person. One July evening really drove that lesson home. We had neighbors coming over after supper. The day had been brutally hot, the kind of day where even the shade seemed tired. Before anybody arrived, my father-in-law watered the porch. Nothing dramatic, just 2 buckets. Then he sat down. An hour later, the neighbors arrived, and something interesting happened. Nobody was told where to sit. Nobody was given instructions. Yet every single person ended up on the porch. Nobody chose the driveway. Nobody chose the yard. Nobody stood in the sun. They all drifted toward the most comfortable space available. Nobody discussed cooling. Nobody talked about temperature. They just sat where it felt best. That is what good design does. People don't notice it. They simply enjoy it. And that brings me to something many families have forgotten. The summer kitchen, older Amish families understood heat differently. Instead of trying to cool a house after it became hot, they tried not to heat it up in the first place. Cooking creates enormous amounts of heat. Boiling, baking, canning, wood stoves, all of it adds heat to the living space. So what did many families do? They moved the heat somewhere else. A separate room, a separate building, a separate kitchen. That way the living space stayed comfortable. Again, the goal wasn't to fight heat. The goal was to manage it intelligently. My father-in-law admired that way of thinking. The summer kitchen prevented heat. The watered porch remove stored heat. The shade tree blocked heat. The breeze carried heat away. Nothing worked alone. Everything worked together. That may be the biggest lesson of all. Comfort rarely comes from one thing. It comes from many small things working together. A little shade, a little airflow, a little evaporation, a little timing, a little common sense. My father-in-law trusted common sense more than most people trust gadgets. And honestly, he had a pretty good track record. Now let me be clear. Watering your porch isn't going to turn July into October. It's not magic. It won't make 95 degrees feel like 60, but it can make a noticeable difference, especially on wood porches, especially on concrete, especially during dry weather, and especially in places where people gather. The trick is timing. Pouring water at sunrise doesn't do much. The porch isn't hot yet. Pouring water during the hottest part of the afternoon or before people gather is different. Now you're removing heat that's already stored in the surface. That's when the effect becomes noticeable. My father-in-law understood timing better than most people understand equipment. That sounds funny, but it's true. The older I get, the more I realize wisdom often looks boring. A bucket of water isn't exciting. A porch isn't exciting. Watching somebody pour water on boards isn't exciting. Yet somehow it works. And that's the funny thing about practical knowledge. The most useful ideas rarely look impressive. They simply solve problems. The lesson was never really about the porch. It was about thinking differently. Most people try to overpower summer. My father-in-law worked around it. Most people focused on the air. He focused on the surfaces. Most people wanted bigger solutions. He wanted smarter ones. And because of that, he was often more comfortable than people spending far more money. Even now, every time I see somebody sitting on a hot deck complaining about the weather, I think about those 2 buckets. Simple, practical, easy to laugh at, easy to ignore. Until you try it. Now I'm curious. What is the hottest place around your house during summer? The porch? The deck? The driveway? The garage? Let me know in the comments. And if somebody in your family had an old summer trick that actually worked, I'd love to hear about it. Because some of the best lessons don't come from books. They come from people who spent a lifetime paying attention